Okay, we try to see what was the role of a human factor in the change of energy system. We will see the paper is divided into 3 steps. The first one is dedicated to the methodology that we used, so the study of anticipatory experiences, and to tell you a little bit what is the empirical base of the research, what was the empirical. The second, what was the problem to describe and to work with energy transition. And the third part is dedicated to a conceptualization that we designed during the research that is called the human energy approach. Okay, we can go. So the challenge at the beginning of the research was very big. The question was, how can we study the future? Because we were supposed to give information for the model, but on the basis of facts and of empirical observation and not on mere hypothesis. To try to answer to this question, we adopted that approach of anticipatory experiences. So we identified a set of experiences of energy transition. That means local experiences that have some basic feature of a possible future low-carbon society. So experiences that have already developed a new way of producing, consuming, and managing energy. The idea that lies behind that choice is that studying this local context, we can get some indication on the key social dynamics that may characterize a future energy transition process, or at least more than other approach to gain a deeper understanding of the transition. We started from a long list of 1,500 potential candidates, and we selected the 90 projects in 19 countries that are the little dots on the map. And just to give you the idea of what kind of project we worked with, are heterogeneous from what they did. There are projects concentrated on transport, some of energy efficient housing. Here is just some example. Some was focused on the generation at property level or community-owned renewable energy. Some was holistic, some experience that adopted an holistic, sustainable approach, so that worked on several different issues altogether. Anticipatory experience varied from small towns to big cities. Okay, this is just some example. What was the problem at the beginning of the research to deal with energy transition? We observed that although there is a broad agreement about the need to carry out radical change in energy system, it remains unclear how to do and to make effective the way to achieve these results. And there was another problem at the beginning, that a lot of approaches that wanted to study energy transition were based on acceptance or social acceptance. So on an approach that had to consider the human factor as a receptor of the change and not as an agent of change. So all that people have to do is accept technology or norms, or have to adopt a sustainable lifestyle, but that are decided elsewhere. And so we go and look into anticipatory experiences just to see and observe what was really the role of human factor in the process of transition. And what we observed was quite surprising, because we have seen in this local context that most of them were characterized by a discontinuity with the past and a break. And it was exactly the rising of human factor that was that passed from a peripheral role to a lead role in the change of energy system. What we observed, this is a very synthetical way of telling that, was a deep change, and that was really unexpected. It was a deep change in the social context that we studied, because the change of energy system was linked with a social change more general. And it was like a path, these 4 points is like a path that is the shape in which the energy transition experiences, the anticipatory experiences, moved. They developed an anticipatory awareness. That means they take seriously the dangers that are ahead in the future. And then they developed a critical attitude to contemporary society, not just in the production of energy, but also, for example, in the way power is exercised. And so all that combined things bring them to adopt innovative approaches, like multidisciplinary approaches, participative approaches, and so on. And this brings it to the construction of new social configuration based also on a change, very big change also at the individual level. That means that new leadership arises, new symbols were introduced, new meanings in everyday life, and also practice of everyday life changed radically. But this process was not a hike, was not a pleasure walking, because with these changes, with these deep changes, it's something like a stress situation happened in the anticipatory experiences. And so along with human factor arise also a lot of risk, new risks. For example, social conflicts. These little experiences was full of conflicts between, for example, different professionals or different departments of the city, or conflicts with cyclists and car users, or conflicts with public administration, a lot of conflicts. A dissonance with the surrounding reality. That is something that we talked about also this morning. So people outside the experience looked at that experience like a strange object that was not so common. And also, for example, there was some dissonance with the legal framework. They tried to do innovative things, but they do not fit with the normative settling of the places. And there was a lot of tension due to personal resistance to change. So people do not want to change their attitude and lifestyle. And last but not least, there was also conflicts within the promoter groups. So what we observed is that in all that experiences, the human factor had really a strong weight. And that was quite unexpected, because in principle, you may change technology and change energy system without changing so deeply. And so we asked what was really the role of human factor in energy transition. And to give an answer to this question, we introduced this approach, the human energy approach, that was taken from previous philosophers like Teilhard de Chardin and Nikola Tesla, but we bring it, that was just an idea, and bring it to sociological realms. So why we talk about human energy? We talk, why human? Because in energy system in transition, the energy system in transition that we have observed, the hidden role that human factor exert in energy system became more visible. So all the human component that make the energy system work became more visible in the experience of energy transition. So it's crucial to adopt a broader concept that can include not only the technological, broader concept of energy that can include not only the technological aspect, but also social and personal dynamism. So human energy is an holistic approach, an holistic understanding articulated in 3 dimensions. The extrasomatic energy, which is the capacity to use the energy that is outside the body, so all the traditional forms of energy. The social energy, which is the capacity to activate the actors present at the local scale to obtain the results of energy transition. And the endosomatic energy, which is the capacity to use directly the body to work for energy transition. An example is very easy, it's going by bike, so using the body inside the energy system. And this approach shows different ways in which human factor is behind the energy system in transition. Why we talk about energy? Because energy is the capacity to do a work, and the project shed a light on how human factor may be able to make energy transition work, because in these experiences they, of course, at the local scale, but they managed to do that. And so human energy is essential both to trigger energy transition and to manage, overcome the risks that are linked to the rise of human factor. And we identified, and that's the very end of the presentation, 3 social functions in which human factor is working for obtaining energy transition. The first is the localization function. You can go ahead. The localization function is linked to the extrasomatic energy, so the capacity to use the energy that comes from outside the body. And the technology becomes more visible and more close in that experiences to citizens and to normal people, because there is a localized production of energy. Energy became produced locally. There are technical networks on the local scale, and there are technical skills that spreads among citizens, and there are a lot of time there are shared ownership of the means of production of energy. The social energy took the shape and exercised the function of cybernetic function of self-regulation. And that is interesting because it's very different from the consent, because when we talk about consent, it's like if the change was assumed to be all in one shot and the people have to consent to that change. And what we observed was a system of self-regulation in which citizens organized themselves and organized the surrounding reality to change over time, take decision over time, and to control the energy system. For example, there was an active participation of citizens in decision making. There was a practice of negotiation that was very important to cope with all the conflicts that I mentioned before. There was a continuous exercise of communication at different levels, from informal communication to institutional and more traditional communication. And there was the creation of an institutional space for energy transition, both involving a traditional institution, both creating a new institution. Okay, just the last one. The repositioning function is the function, it's linked to an increased use of the body in everyday lives. And that is explainable. In the 70s, we thought of the future like a place where people have a big head and tiny body, and everything was driven by machines and technology. What we observed was quite opposite trend, and people has an increased resort to muscular strength, for example, cycling or taking public transport, or, for example, they had an increased attention to practical issue of everyday life, what we eat, how the food is grown, and a lot of things, the perception of self is reframed into the energy system. So people start thinking of themselves like a wheel into the energy for the functioning of energy system. And that's just the answer to the question that was done. Some of this information approaches was used in the scenario building and in the model reformulation. For example, there was a technical adjustment of this model that was used a lot of time to include, for example, repositioning function and endosomatic energy, and inserting into the model, for example, the cycle modes of transport. Okay.
Thank you, Giovanni.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Detail on your final point here. I was just wondering if you're adjusting this model to allow for non-motorized transportation, does it include the increase in time it takes for non-motorized transport, and therefore the likelihood of there being a lower amount of any energy-intensive behavior occurring when you get there, if you like?
Oh, can you repeat the last, maybe with...
If it takes someone longer to get to work, then they're going to be at work for less time. And being at work with the heating and the lighting on is more energy intensive than walking. If people spend more time walking around, they're less energy intensive.
No, there was taken, the time use was taken into account, but I don't know exactly if it was reduced at the time of work. I don't think so. Also, if the model is a model that is based on economic general equilibrium, so if something changes, something else will change consequently. But I don't know from a technical point of view how, because it's done. This work is done by the CIRED. It's an institute of CNRS.
Thank you, Giovanni. I will now ask the discussants to come forward and provide some comments to this paper. So first, Joyce, who's standing in for Holger.
So thank you, Giovanni, for your presentation. I found it really interesting also to read the paper on what you did. And I think the human factor approach is quite an interesting way to look at it. So actually I've some questions, maybe some for clarification or maybe some to elaborate a bit more on it. So I have a quick view at my notes. Yeah, actually you started out with that the role of the human factor seems to be very important. So I was wondering to what extent it came out of the studying the initiatives, or it was already an idea you started with and then looking at it. So how does it relate to the study of the initiatives? So maybe related to that is let's see.
Just to understand how we discovered what was the tool to study the initiatives.
Don't change the microphone. The reactions afterwards.
Oh, sorry. Oh.
Can you react afterwards?
Yeah. You asked how we discovered it and what was the tool that we used to understand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so actually also how did you go from the initiatives to, how did they lead to these kind of functions, also of the human factors, and whether you see like the kind of initiatives you described were very diverse, whether you see patterns in it? Like, are there some specific type of initiatives that lead to specific functions? Yeah, okay. Then what I also find interesting, like it was mentioned in the in your overview of the project at all, that you also want to make a policy implications. So I was wondering, like, whether you can elaborate maybe a little bit more on what this approach adds to what extent it leads to policy advice, or how you can learn from it for policy implementations. And I also was a bit intrigued by the endosomatic energy you mentioned, and I think it's a bit related to the previous question. Like, I think it was yesterday in the presentation that we heard that people are spending more time on information, for example, but also on food. And how does it relate with using it to reduce the energy consumption production? Yeah, that was basically it. Yeah.
Yeah, grazie, Giovanni. Yeah, very interesting notion. I find this, the anticipatory experiences as a category. It needs some time to settle in how that differs from transition initiatives or other kinds of initiatives we'll be talking about. But in terms of unit of analysis, it's quite interesting for us all to consider, I think, how these two relate. Yeah, main things you want to study on the basis of facts and not hypothesis. Of course, the difficulty is that these facts on the future are on short supply. You take these anticipatory experiences as a basis for this. And at some points in the paper, I read that these anticipatory experiences, that they show a rise of the human factor. But that really raised the question with me is how these anticipatory experiences, the 90 out of 1500, I think, how they have been selected, because how they show that is very much dependent on how you select them. And it was a very large miscellany of energy-related cases. They seemed to be quite civil society oriented. They seemed to be relatively low tech as far as I could see from the slides very shortly. But all that, of course, very much depends what you actually see. And this becomes actually even more important, this selection of anticipatory experiences as evidence basis. As in the paper you describe how can energy transition be achieved. There is a need for energy transition, and we see certain evidence of energy transition, and the mixture of these three, and that's not only your paper, but it's more generally something that confuses me in transition study, the interspersal of there is a need for, we see, leading to quite complex lines of arguments. And there we easily slip into illusions and selective observations and wanting to see and seeing what we want to see. I'm sorry if this sounds harsh. What you say, attempts so far towards this transition are not yielding expected results. They're necessary but not sufficient. Therefore, human agency needs to become a constitutive element of transformation. And human agency that cannot be really continue to be conceived in terms of humans as receptors of energy in a passive view on them. I find this very interesting take, also because it resonates with the narratives of change I hear and observe in energy innovation. this problematization of the passive position of human individuals. And there I have two questions. Actually a bit more, but let's try two. Is this receptor position, is it inherently unsustainable or problematic? So do you think that if we find energy solutions that are high-tech and just continue the way it is now, that I just use energy, I plug into the sockets, I can hardly switch a light bulb because I know there's a lot of, there's institutions resolving this for me, and so I can specialize in some research activities, for example. Which makes me very passive as an individual in this system. Is this inherently undesirable? Is there a certain alienation thesis that you're developing here within your projects? Do you develop scenarios in which individuals are more upstream and downstream, and contrasting those? I would find that very interesting, because they might both be sustainable, but they will have very different societal consequences and implications. I should round up, I guess. The concept of human energy, I like it as a line of investigation, as a concept. On the other hand, it's I'm sorry to say this, it's hopelessly misleading, because the kind of energy you're talking about is really different from the energy used to drive equipment and things, and they cannot be substituted. In the case of the bicycle, that's maybe one of the few exceptions actually where it can be substituted, at least on the short distance. But I think either you have to explain the human energy really extensively, or you find another word, but otherwise it becomes very complicated. Also, and that's my last point, because there's another thing that I was missing a bit in your short and concise presentation of the project, and that is power. About human energy. Human energy is not necessarily humane energy, because one human who is very important in the energy system at the moment, Vladimir Putin and the system around him, somehow I couldn't see Vladimir in the whole story, and he is definitely an important factor in human energy. And he also immediately, just by naming him, we come to that point of power relations that are so very important. And then again, you have the physical, as physicists use it, the power, and as political scientists use it. So then again, the same as with the energy, please try to find words to keep the two apart. And some other things I could just share on a one-on-one, because I've been too extensive already.
Thank you very much, Bonno.
Okay, there are a lot of issues. I try to go from put it in a logical way. As far as regards the anticipatory experiences as a unit of analysis, this point is very close to the following one, which is how they were selected, and because you asked what is the difference between, anticipatory experiences and best practice, for example. Okay. Of course, we selected it using some criteria that was arbitrary, not objective, but was the same for all the experiences, and that was why we selected them. It was one criteria was to obtain some significant results in terms of sustainability, but there is a certain degree of variation between the different experiences. We also now it's a very synthetic presentation, but in the 2 reports that we have written, we also make some differentiation inside the anticipatory experiences, and that's also partly an answer to the question of pattern. For example, of course, repositioning function is more strong on the stronger on the experiences based on mobility, or where mobility plays a good role. While, for example, cybernetic function is spread almost everywhere. So it's very important for quite old experiences. So we first criteria was having good sustainable results in terms of production and consumption of energy, and another criteria was there was then 4 criteria. There was one criteria was that they have to be experiences that were not just cognitive, so not educational experiences, but experiences that have some impact on reality. So some there were in effect there are a lot of them that are very technological. There are not just organization innovation. There are many of them that use new sustainable houses. And there was a criteria of transparency that was a methodological criteria. So we took just the experiences who had some material on it that wanted to be known. So we didn't go door by door because it was impossible. So we took experiences that worked not just on one issue, so not just introducing, for example, bicycle, but that worked on at least also if in different degree, in a more systemic way, systematicity. So there was a pocket of criteria that led us to identify them. And yes, there was the questions on the position of receptor of human factor. There are two different answers. The first one is that in the experiences that we have studied that do not take human factor in the right, didn't give to the human factor the right importance, they found a lot of obstacles. So one of the results, intermediate results, was that if you work a lot on technology without without considering human, without doing something like strong effort on human factor, you will not manage to, you cannot get the same results. You have a lot of problem. And the other answer is that, of course, hypothetically, it's possible to find a technology that is like the one that we use now, and we have not to do nothing. But what we found in the anticipatory experiences is that at the moment this technology do not exist, and only way to use the technology that are alternatives to the one that we use normally is to activate the human factor. And that is also, I will go very quickly, and on the question of power, it was interesting because that is a thing that should be studied more. But of course, power, for example, the exercise put in is linked to a form of energy that is stored and is controlled by strong power, while, for example, renewable energy is per se more democratic form of energy. And what we have seen that to move from one system to another, because energy is very rooted very deeply into our everyday life, is not possible to do that also because there are strongest tie of power. It's not possible to do that just changing the technology, probably because the person that hold the technology do not want that. And so it is for that, also for that in these little cases, and that was really a surprise. We did not select them for that reason. There was some minor revolutions from the way of power, the way that power was exercised. So something like it's blocked situation, and you can change it just with a very deep social change.